Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Parent Hacks presentation on making the best of interpretation services. Bienvenido a esta noche el taller de trucos de padres para cómo mejor aprovechar los servicios de interpretación con Mario García. Mario Garcia is the supervisor for San Diego Unified School District Special Education Translation and Interpretation Department. He has over 18 years of experience as an interpreter translator with specific focus on educational translation and interpretation. In addition to his role at San Diego Unified, Mario specializes in developing workshops and best practice curriculums designed specifically for interpreters and translators working in the nuanced field of special education. Lately, he has been leading workshops to help interpreters adapt to the remote interpretation environment. Mario García es supervisor del Departamento de Traducción e Interpretación de Educación Especial del Distrito Escolar Unificado de San Diego. Tiene más de 18 años de experiencia como intérprete, traductor y como un enfoque específico en traducción e interpretación educativa. Además de su rol en el Distrito Escolar Unificado de San Diego, Mario se especializa en desarrollar talleres y currículum de estudios de mejoría, prácticas diseñados específicamente para intérpretes y traductores que también trabajan en el campo matizado de educación especial. Últimamente ha estado dirigiendo talleres para ayudar a los intérpretes a adaptar a la interpretación remota. Welcome, Mario. Bienvenido, Mario.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know that prior to starting, we had talked about, I had asked for folks to just let us know if you're a staff member, a parent. So if you wouldn't mind just putting that in the chat, just so that we kind of know. This presentation is geared for both staff and families. I'm just kind of curious to know. Señora María, si puede poner en el chat, ¿usted es mamá, es madre de un estudiante, trabaja en una agencia o con departamento de algo de educación relacionado a la educación? Si pudiera compartir en el chat en español, está bien. So tonight you're going to get a real good sense of an interpreter at work doing his own interpretation today. So I'm excited to be able to do that for you all. I know that we have some folks here that have a background in or work in education as liaisons. Esta noche, señora María, tenemos aquí a personas que trabajan en el campo de educación y nomás simplemente que vamos a empezar con esta presentación. Are we ready? All right. So just quickly about this work and the framework for this presentation. This presentation was really designed for families of students who have IEPs that receive special education services. And there was a need to kind of work not just specifically with staff, but to also work with family members who maybe sometimes perhaps were walking into situations where they weren't used to working with a professional interpreter and were perhaps previously kind of having their meetings in environments where they weren't necessarily working with a professional interpreter and kind of the guidelines and best practices that interpreters follow. So the purpose of this was to kind of maximize the use and the role of the interpreter. La presentación de esta noche abarca varios temas. Principalmente era una presentación para hablar de los servicios de interpretación y cómo los padres podían mejor aprovechar estos servicios para cuando tuvieran sus IEPs. Muchas veces los padres, quizás si no habían trabajado ya con un intérprete profesional, era difícil saber cuáles eran las expectativas. Entonces se diseñó para padres que tienen estudiantes, hijos, hijas en educación especial y cómo trabajar específicamente dentro de este contexto. So tonight I want to focus on two major things in interpretation in the educational environment. Specifically best practices for effective communication. And I want to kind of give a little background before we start, but like I said already in my intro, this is a guide for families and staff that work with interpreters during the IEP process, right? My background is in interpretation in legal interpretation, medical interpretation. As my bio said, I've been in this field specifically in interpretation for 18 years, 20 years if you take into consideration my 2 years where I started doing translation. But very early in my career, I realized I had a passion for working in education, but to take it one step further, specifically in special education. And I'll get to why I was fascinated by the work in special education later in my presentation. Bueno, esta presentación va a hablar ahora de las mejores prácticas o guías para la comunicación dentro del IEP. Sí, es para padres y personal docentes que interactúan con el intérprete, cómo mejor aprovechar esos servicios. Yo principalmente trabajé como intérprete legal, pero por ya casi son 18, 20 años, si incluye mi experiencia como traductor. Pero este trabajo, yo ingresé al ámbito de la interpretación en educación, pero más específicamente en educación especial, y voy a hablar un poco por qué me impactó ese trabajo y por qué lo hago específicamente en educación especial. So right now, currently in interpretation and education, there's kind of like a three-prong approach happening. There are three major things happening in education interpretation. If you look at the right here, one of those major things is language access. I don't know if how many folks have heard this is kind of a hot topic or a hot button issue right now in the field of education interpretation. It's in general, language access is a big topic right now in interpretation, but specifically in education. And then, of course, simultaneously at the same time, and I'm not going to really talk too much about the professionalization aspect of it, but interpreters in education are very close to professionalizing as the other fields in interpretation, as our medical, have professional certifications, legal interpreters have professional certifications, American Sign Language interpreters have a certification. So the specific work of education interpretation is very close to professionalizing. And there are a lot of groups nationally, locally, at a state level that are working kind of in conjunction to push this professionalization, which is, of course, going to pay dividends for the work that interpreters provide within an educational context. And then, of course, because of that, there is an expansion of services, because as more folks use interpretation services, we learn how great of a need there is, and we also learn how important it is to have a professional interpreter, or at least if we want to at least not say maybe professional, somebody who's been trained in providing services within the educational context, which is very specific, and I'll get into that in my next slide. Bueno, hablando ahora de ahorita la interpretación está en un punto clave con respecto, son tres caminos que está tomando la interpretación. Principalmente algo que le llamamos acceso al idioma. Es un tema que ahorita voy a mencionar a qué se refiere este tema del acceso al idioma. Es un tema muy sonado ahorita dentro de la interpretación a nivel nacional, a nivel de organizaciones federales que proporcionan servicios a personas que hablan un idioma aparte del inglés. Especialmente en la educación, y también existe lo de la profesionalización de la interpretación educativa. Está al borde ahorita los intérpretes a punto de que trabajan en educación en ingresar a un punto donde este trabajo se va a hacer profesional oficialmente, así como uno necesita una certificación para ser intérprete médico, para ser intérprete legal. Va a existir un momento muy pronto, esperamos, donde va a haber una certificación específica para trabajar como intérprete educativo. Finalmente, esto conlleva expansión de servicios, ampliación de servicios, porque como mucha gente quizás lo sepa o no, cuando uno trabaja con un intérprete, podemos entender la necesidad de trabajar con un intérprete, la importancia de trabajar con un intérprete. So, language access. I'm going to focus on two very specific things today. And the first one will be language access. And then the second one will be, why work with an interpreter, right? What is the not only the advantage, but why is it so necessary that we prepare folks that work in those educational contexts? If they're not going to be professionally certified, that at least they have some type of background and some type of training for working that require language interpretation. So language access, like I've already mentioned, is a big, very very in vogue thing being discussed across the different interpretation groups. So I'll talk a little bit about language access. So what is language access, right? It's a plan that delineates how services are to be provided for individuals, right, that don't speak English as a first language. Entonces, ¿qué es el acceso al idioma? Es un plan al idioma que describe cómo se proporcionarán los servicios para las personas que no hablan inglés como primer idioma. So, and why is language access so important? Well, some of the challenges, specifically when families, especially, and I'm talking now specifically within the special education context, a lot of the times it's not so much for lack of wanting to provide services that school districts or that schools in particular don't provide these services or don't remember to provide these services. There's a thing in interpretation that, you know, we're almost like an afterthought. Interpreters are an afterthought. And it's not so much like it's not like a sinister thing or something where where folks are trying to deny access. It's just that it becomes very challenging for those folks that need those services and for the folks that are requesting the services to know, how do I go about doing that? And a language access plan helps to address that need, helps to clarify how do we know who needs interpretation? How do we know who needs translation? How do we identify these things? Sometimes it really can be an intimidating process to go through, especially if you don't speak another language, if you're not familiar with what the requirements are. So this is kind of what a language access plan hopes to address. Entonces, el plan de acceso al idioma ayuda a proporcionar estos servicios, ayuda a aclarar cómo es que estos servicios se proporcionan, cómo las personas que requieren los servicios, a veces no es porque las personas que están solicitando los servicios, el personal de las escuelas o los distritos, no quieran proporcionar los servicios o no quieran dar este apoyo, es simplemente que a veces no saben exactamente cómo llevar a cabo este proceso de solicitar los servicios, y el plan ayuda a aclarar eso. So, just some major points with regard to the law. You see kind of the highlight, and this is kind of the framework from which language access was born out of, starting with the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that you know was a call to not discriminating folks on the basis of race or national origin, and you know, those are the two major ones that kind of fall into that category. But of course we have other descriptions in there, and which I can't recall right now, but more or less we're kind of all familiar with this law. In 2000, there was a federal executive order signed into law that basically it called out for the first time that federal agencies or agencies that receive public funding needed to provide access to services for persons that were LEPs, or limited English proficient. That's the way the law was written. We don't refer to folks that speak another language other than English at home, or that whose native language is not English. We refer to them now as ELs, English learners, or ELLs, English language learners. So that's kind of, if you see those terms, LEP is kind of like the old term, but this is kind of the most important one. This is public entities had to essentially identify and start providing services with regard to language access. Entonces, con respecto a los puntos claves de la ley, como pueden ver ahí, en 1964 se firmó la ley de derechos civiles, una ley muy conocida en Estados Unidos, con respecto a la falta que no se podía discriminar en base a raza o ascendencia étnica. Entonces, de ahí parte este plan del cual vamos a hablar el día de hoy. En el año 2000 se firmó la ley que específicamente decía que se tenían que mejorar los servicios para las personas que se les conocen como LEP, o personas con dominio limitado del inglés. Ya no se les conoce como LP, ahora se les conoce como ELL o EL, que es más comúnmente ahora se les conoce como personas que aprenden inglés o personas en vías de aprender inglés. So what's the difference? So there are two major things here. One thing is a language access plan. The other one is a language access policy, right? And just to really make it really simple, a plan is essentially a course of action. So identifying what the needs are and how we're going to go about carrying out the guaranteeing of access to language for folks that need this support, right? And the policy, of course, is kind of a set of rules and regulations that ensures that those measures are being that those organizations, those public entities, those public organizations that are providing services to folks, that those rules are kind of like the accountability processes or the measures that are going to ensure that this plan is carried out, right? And this is where I like to ask for those folks that work as folks that are on the staff side, how many of you have heard of a language access plan or are familiar with a language access plan? Maybe your school or your district has something like a language access plan. If anybody wants to chime in or if anybody wants to make a comment, I'd be happy to hear. If not, we can just continue. Is anybody here familiar with a language access plan? Has anybody heard of a language access plan?
This is Joe. I have heard of it because I worked at an agency where I had to help develop the language access plan. They received federal funding.
Entonces, el señor Joe dijo que sí, porque reciben fondos federales y que sí él está familiarizado con eso porque reciben fondos federales. Hay que aclarar la diferencia entre un plan de acceso lingüístico y la política. El plan es el curso de acción, esas son las leyes que se diseñan, el plan que se diseña para abordar la necesidad del lenguaje, y la política es el conjunto de las reglas y reglamentos, regulaciones que toman efecto y que hacen rendición de cuentas para asegurar que se esté llevando a cabo el plan. And then just to give just like, I told you this is kind of a hot topic issue right now. The city of San Diego, Parks and Recreations just recently conducted an audit of its Parks and Rec services. And one of the things that they were dinged for, that they when the audit came back, that they really needed to improve upon and change, was that their access to communities where folks spoke a language other than English, right? So it's no surprise that if you don't have access to language, if you don't have translation of materials, if you don't translation or interpretation of the communication that's going out to the community, it's kind of hard to participate if you don't really know what's happening in your local community. So one of the things the city of San Diego, the Parks and Recreation, one of the recommendations was for them to develop a language access plan. So it's just, it's a thing that I think it's a topic or a concept that has kind of reached critical mass now, that everybody is more or less talking about it. And I think here in the future, in the next 5 years, we're going to see a change in the way that these plans and ultimately these policies affect access for folks that speak a language other than English. Entonces, recientemente la ciudad de San Diego tuvo una auditoría de los servicios que proporcionaban para los servicios de recreación, los parques y recreación. Y una de las cosas que nació de esa auditoría es que tenía que haber un mejor esfuerzo para incluir a las personas de comunidades donde había acceso limitado con respecto a traducción e interpretación. Entonces, una de las recomendaciones más grandes de la auditoría fue que se tenía que desarrollar un plan y eventualmente una política para asegurar que las familias, las personas, miembros de la comunidad que participaban, iban a poder tener acceso equitativo. And, I'm just going to kind of move through this because I want to make sure I get to the interpretation part, but this is more or less more language and more information related to this access policy and this access to language. The primary thing here, of course, is this is all related to interpretation, and I kind of wanted to give a background and a preface because we need to ensure that we have meaningful communication. And the only way that you ensure meaningful communication is by having folks participate as, equal stakeholders with the rest of the members of, in this case, for us, for tonight, of the IEP team, right? it's difficult to make an informed decision, to have informed consent if you don't have meaningful communication or participation during a meeting. And what interpreters, a person who's trained as an interpreter can guarantee and ensure is that those families that receive or need those services are able to participate in an equitable manner. And more about that in a little bit, but again, you're going to hear me talk about this a lot tonight. The driving force, at least for us at San Diego Unified and my department for special education, is, are we providing folks, are we fostering an environment where folks can have meaningful communication with the rest of the team? And ultimately, after the meaningful communication, are we providing enough? Are we providing a service that allows folks to make informed consent when it comes to the educational rights of their students, of their children, right? Entonces, nomás hacer hincapié en que tenemos que garantizar esta comunicación significativa. Doy toda esta información de fondo porque quiero que todo el mundo se entere de la importancia de que hay que tener un intérprete disponible para que pueda proporcionar ese acceso a las familias que requieren estos servicios, que requieren la interpretación. Es muy difícil poder entender estos conceptos y tomar decisiones informadas si no podemos participar de una forma significativa e equitativa. Entonces, lo que proporcionan los intérpretes es este acceso, es ese vínculo, ese enlace entre las escuelas y los padres y finalmente las personas que toman las decisiones de parte de sus hijos. So I'm going to kind of skip over this. I've kind of more or less talked about this is just more information on kind of the language access implementation and how do school districts or schools go about implementing a language access plan. The major takeaway here is to be able to identify what the need is. So it's not enough to say we have a language access plan, but we need to know who are our families, right? Who are we serving? What languages do we need to serve? And, you know, for a lot of our school districts, not a lot. The main way that school districts know whether a family needs interpretation or translation services is through that initial home language survey, right? And there are 4 categories: listening, reading, speaking, and writing, right? And if any of those come up as a family maybe speaks a language other than English in the home, or they speak their native language is Somali, if any of those 4 come up, then that triggers, or that sets off, that raises kind of like it starts a process where that child is identified as possibly a English language learner, right? Sometimes a student cannot be an English learner, but their family still needs those services and those supports. So part of the responsibility of school districts and schools is to identify who are those folks that need those services, and how do we know who needs those services, and how do we go about guaranteeing that we have the most latest up-to-date information as to who is going to require these services. Because sometimes we have a lot of folks that we find out on the day of the IEP that they need an interpreter, and that's too late to try to find an interpreter. We're sometimes even finding out a day before. The law says that we need to at least have 3 days notice, or at least identify with 3 days, 3 business days to whether a family is going to need interpretation or translation support. Entonces, finalmente, lo último que quiero hacer hincapié aquí sería que los distritos y las escuelas tienen que identificar quiénes son las personas que necesitan estos servicios, y no solamente identificar que estén actualizados hasta último momento de saber quiénes son las personas que requieren los servicios, dónde podemos acceder a esa información, cómo identificar, porque no podemos esperarnos hasta el día del IEP para decir necesitamos un intérprete y de repente están utilizando una persona que no está preparada para ser el intérprete. Okay? So now let's talk about working with an interpreter. You know, one of the things sometimes, if we're not able to identify who those folks are that need those services, it can be a challenge for teams. It puts a strain on teams. You know, teams sometimes staff, educators, and folks that work with our students that have IEPs, there are a lot of moving parts to making sure we get people to a place so that we can have the meeting and we can have it at a specific date and time, right? It is one of the procedural safeguards that families have to have a meeting at a mutually agreed upon time and place. And then all of a sudden you forget, and like I said earlier, the interpreter becomes an afterthought. One of the big pushes in my department, in my district, and one of the big pushes on a national level is, how do we work with staff so that everybody on staff knows how do I know if somebody needs services, and then where do I go to get services, right? A lot of the times the holdup isn't necessarily, and I said this in the beginning, it's not that maybe perhaps teams or school districts don't want to provide the services. A lot of the times folks just don't know where to go to get the service, and the service is there, and a meeting will happen and interpreters were available. But how do we create a culture at a school site where everyone more or less knows, if I am the person greeting folks at the front office, if I am the custodian, if I am or the building services supervisor, how would I go about getting an interpreter, and when do I need an interpreter, and who do I talk to, right? So it's not this mystery about like, well, this person I think maybe needs an interpreter. How do we identify? How do we know? Sometimes that can be a real big challenge for folks at sites. Entonces, cómo trabajar con un intérprete es cuestión de que culturalmente, la cultura de la escuela, las personas sepan cómo identificar quién requiere los servicios, a dónde acudir para pedir los servicios, porque a veces muchas cosas tienen que suceder en un IEP, ¿verdad? Tenemos que tener a todos los proveedores de servicios. Uno de los derechos bajo los procedimientos legales es que los padres tienen derecho a que las juntas se lleven a un lugar, una hora mutuamente establecida. Entonces, a veces eso conlleva ciertos dificultades con respecto a proporcionar el intérprete, porque si no saben a dónde acudir, no saben a qué número hablar, entonces esto crea estas situaciones donde le hablan al intérprete de último momento, o tienen que buscar a una persona en la oficina o otra persona que venga a interpretar para poder ser el intérprete. Y no queremos eso, queremos crear una cultura, un ambiente escolar donde todos saben, si necesito un intérprete, desde el conserje hasta la secretaria, el secretario, ¿a dónde hablo? ¿Con quién hablo? ¿Cómo pido un intérprete? I think the big thing here for this one is here. Can everyone see this bottom part here? All right. You see my cursor going over the being bilingual is not enough. Aquí lo más importante sería esta parte que estoy subrayando acá, donde dice ser bilingüe no es suficiente. And why this, right? Why does it take somebody more than a bilingual person to provide these interpretation services? Well, primarily because the interpreter, the professional interpreter, is specifically trained to work with the nuance, not just of language, but all of the parts that create that environment that fosters effective communication, that leads to meaningful participation, that leads to that informed consent that is of most concern for us, or at least to be able to provide access to that, right? So why is it important to request a professional interpreter? Well, because a professional interpreter provides a broad set of tools to support families that need the services to engage and participate in a meaningful manner. And then, of course, the informed consent. Entonces, ¿por qué es importante? Bueno, porque no nomás es ser bilingüe. Lo importante aquí es que las familias puedan participar de una forma sea significativa. Sí, que se pueda proporcionar un servicio donde los padres puedan tomar decisiones informadas, porque lo que un intérprete proporciona es una gama amplia de herramientas que ayudan a facilitar esa participación. Están preparados específicamente para trabajar con las necesidades específicas que ayudan a fomentar esa comunicación significativa. So what do professional interpreters do? And why is it important to work with an interpreter for my IEP meeting, and how can I make the most of the resources? Entonces, ¿Qué hacen los intérpretes profesionales? ¿Por qué es importante trabajar con un intérprete para mi junta de IEP? ¿Cómo puedo aprovechar al máximo el recurso de un intérprete durante mi junta? I'm going to stop there to see if anybody has any questions. Voy a detenerme ahí si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, algo que quieran, un comentario. No sé si alguien tenga algo que quieran decir. Anybody has any questions? Okay, we can move on. Let's just talk about this first. So this is something that kind of comes up a lot, and of course nobody's expected to know this unless you're an interpreter or a translator, because those two terms can be used interchangeably, and it's really not that big a deal, but it is because there are two separate things, right? Translation is of course the translation of text, the document. Think of the IEP document. That's the translation, right? The text that gets translated. And interpretation is, of course, the facilitating of the oral communication, right? Whether it's simultaneous, consecutively, or between users of different languages. Entonces, es aquí importante mencionar que la traducción diferente a la interpretación, es muy importante que se haga la distinción, porque una obviamente es lo que se refiere a la traducción, es traducir palabras de un texto en un idioma a otro. Es el texto, lo escrito, la interpretación es facilitar la comunicación oral, ¿sí? Son dos términos que se usan, que se intercambian, pero que en realidad tienen que ver dos cosas muy diferentes. So what does a professional interpreter do? I don't know if y'all have heard of the term cultural brokers, or no sé si, ¿qué hace un intérprete profesional? Son agentes culturales, right? Part of your training as an interpreter involves not necessarily being trained on the cultural nuances of working with different groups across different cultures, but how to deal with those possible cultural situations where there's cultural interference. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So part of the training is to develop an expert understanding of the vocabulary, the terminology of the educational jargon. You know, we speak, edu-speak, you know, we know the terminology. Education tends to have a really very specific, really insider type of speaking about things. And we know the terms as interpreters, we can use the terms, we know the interpretation of it, but part of our role is to ensure that if somebody uses a term like play dates, for example, okay? In the United States, it's very common to say something like, does, you know, and this happens a lot in my meetings, you know, does your child have play dates, right? Do they schedule play dates with other children? And I can interpret that. I can interpret play dates. That's very straightforward, right? But sometimes play dates doesn't have the same cultural meaning on the other side when I interpret it to Spanish, because maybe somebody will catch the nuance of that, but I need to adapt that language so that when I say play date, maybe I need to say something like, does your son or daughter play with cousins, or do they hang out with friends? That's not a direct translation or interpretation of play date. But if I say play date, that information might be completely lost, right? So there I am acting as a cultural broker to make sure that I know what the question is. The question is, does your child have folks or kids that they can play with, right? I, as the interpreter, as the cultural broker, have to translate that and adapt it in such a way that it makes cultural sense to the folks that I'm working with, and then vice versa, right? It works the other way around. Entonces, ¿qué somos agentes culturales? Tenemos esta comprensión del vocabulario, de la terminología, de la jerga educativa. En la educación se usa mucha terminología específica de la educación. Y nosotros como agentes culturales, facilitadores culturales, ayudamos con esos conceptos. Ahorita mencioné la palabra playdates, que son, literalmente se traduce como citas de juego. Pero si yo le digo citas de juego a una familia, es posible que me entiendan y me van a decir, ah, sí entiendo lo que es. Pero si yo digo citas de juego, a lo mejor no tiene nada en qué basarse. Entonces, a veces como intérprete, como agentes culturales, podemos adaptar ese concepto y decir, a ver, su hijo, ¿con quién juega? ¿Tiene primos con quien juega o amigos, los vecinos con los que juegan? Entonces, ahí de repente cambia la cosa. La pregunta era, ¿tiene con quién jugar el niño cuando está en casa o cuando está en su comunidad? Esa es la pregunta en sí. Pero si yo digo citas de juego, a lo mejor por ahí se puede perder ese concepto. Eso es lo que hace un intérprete. Es un agente cultural, que si no tienes esa capacidad, esa capacitación, entonces por ahí se pueden perder ciertos conceptos claves, especialmente cuando estamos hablando de un IEP. So now moving on to, one of the big tenets of interpreter training is the neutrality. It's one of the founding principles of the work that we do as interpreters, is that we are trained to maintain neutrality. And even with our training, there are so many times when that line can be blurred. And interpreters by nature, this is a gross generalization, but interpreters by nature are helper people. They're like first responders. They want to be on the scene to help folks feel heard and communicate and be able to amplify their voice to communicate. But that neutrality is so important. A lot of the times, if at a site, somebody on campus is having to play a dual role, it's not so much that the quality of the interpretation is going to be affected. It's just that now you're putting a person in let's just talk about our colleagues here, the community liaisons. You're now making them wear two hats, right? And you've now impacted the way they can participate as community liaisons, right? It's always going to be better to have the liaison support families with interpretation, right? But if you have a liaison that's like formally trained as an interpreter and is only playing the role of interpreter in that context, and everybody understands that that's the role in that moment, it changes the dynamics of the interpretation, right? Because then it removes that person from the responsibility of having to play also that advocate role that maybe sometimes a liaison would have to play, right? Interpreters are trained to check for meaning, for understanding. Part of the work that we do as interpreters is to make sure, is the information that's being relayed from the source, the English speaker, to the other language, let's say in my case, Spanish, is that information making sense? Do I need to give it context so that it doesn't affect meaning, right? I can say, I can interpret the term or the concept A through G requirements, but that may mean nothing to a family if I don't give context. That sometimes doesn't mean anything to a family that's a native English speaker, right? So how do I put that in context so that I'm not just giving a literal translation of it, right? How do I know as an interpreter? Well, I'm professionally trained to be able to identify, check for understanding in a way that maintains neutrality, right? It's very simple to say, do you understand, right? Well, sometimes saying understand implies a certain type of language that might make a parent feel like, well, geez, if I say no, then that means, are they going to think I'm not understanding? Because are they going to think I'm not following, right? There's a difference between saying, do you understand? And is it clear, right? Do you have any questions? Sometimes as interpreters, we insert ourselves into the process because we know if we're checking for meaning, we're trained to read body language, to read body cues. If we know that this family is maybe not understanding what we're talking about when we're saying A through G, then I can say, you know what, can you please explain A through G to me? Because I don't know if I'm really clear about it, right? And these are like little subtle little things, little soft skills that interpreters are trained to manage so that we remove those barriers to communication. And of course, one of the most important things here at the bottom is the training and the maintaining of confidentiality. And sometimes that neutrality, sometimes not somebody as an outsider who's not assigned to staff, who's coming from an agency or who's coming from a district, a central office department, it can change the dynamics of the interaction, right? Entonces, cuando trabajamos con intérpretes, ellos son sujetos a un código de ética y prácticas que exigen que actúen como terceros neutrales. Entonces, los intérpretes están capacitados para verificar el significado y la comprensión sin afectar o hacer editorializar, ¿sí? O abogar en nombre de algo. Entonces, los intérpretes están capacitados para manejar las posibles barreras a la comunicación. Ahorita mencionaba los requisitos del A al G. ¿Qué son los requisitos del A al G? Bueno, son los requisitos que un alumno debe cumplir para graduarse de la preparatoria, por ejemplo, o ingresar a una universidad. Pero si una familia no sabe, si yo digo A, G y no tiene contexto, a veces hasta los que hablan inglés no tienen contexto, ¿cómo voy a poder yo decirle requisitos A al G sin poder tener contexto? A veces yo como intérprete puedo preguntar. Si yo pregunto, ¿entiende? A veces esto nos puede hacer sentir mal. Si yo digo, ¿entendió? Porque entonces si digo que no, pues entonces van a pensar algo de mí. Pero si digo, ¿le quedó claro? O si digo, ¿quiere que se lo volvamos a repetir? O ¿quiere más detalles? O simplemente yo como intérprete puedo decir, ¿sabes qué? No sé lo que es el A al G. ¿Me pudieras explicar, por favor, a lo que se refieren? Esos son los detalles, trucos, vamos a decir, de un intérprete profesional que ayuda a facilitar esta comunicación. All right, so now we get to the part that I think is the reason why I got into interpretation, specifically in the special education environment. So like I said, I have my background in my last 11 years or so has been working as an education interpreter. One, because I believe in the power of public education. I believe it's something that is a really important force for helping our communities. Of course, when it's done as it's supposed to be, right? But part of that is, for me, the work specifically with special education was that the IEP is a collaborative process. So when I was working as an education interpreter, and I would be assigned to IEP meetings, because I was not assigned to a specific special education interpretation translation department. One thing I noticed is that interpreters, you could have the world's best interpreter, right? They were the most proficient. They had the best control or management of vocabulary. Their level of professionalism, their code of ethics, everything was 100% on point, right? And you could deliver the most perfect interpretation. But without that checking for understanding, without creating that exchange, without the process of exchange and interaction, the IEP is a collaborative process. The IEP is a living, live document that is supposed to be written at the meeting, right? That is supposed to be written in conjunction with the family. It's a collaborative approach. If I am let's just say community interpreter, community trained interpreter, if I'm providing interpretation services for a community event, I'm not going to stop during my interpretation. I'm not going to stop the speaker, and I'm not going to stop the proceedings to say, hold on, let's make sure that this family knows the difference between a modification and an accommodation, right? Those two words can be very interchangeable, especially like for me in Spanish, the way you maneuver through those two words can be really challenging. And I want to make sure that a family understands that what we're talking about is modifications and not accommodations, because that can have a really big effect on that child's educational career, right? Especially at a young age. We're hoping and we're working to build capacity with families so that they understand the nuances of the IEP. If I don't stop to check for meaning and understanding, if I'm not aware of all those potential places where things can go left or right or a different direction, then we might miss a huge opportunity to be able to connect with families so that they understand that, hey, we're talking about a modification, not an accommodation. We're talking about your child is going to be assigned to a course of study that is now all of a sudden not going to allow, not going to be on the diploma bound track, right? And as a parent, I would like to know as soon as possible. I'd like to build that capacity as early as possible to understand that not only are there nuances within this thing and that it's a collaborative process, that I can trust that the interpreter is going to support me through that exchange. Because then, I don't want to get to ninth grade and then someone tells me that my child is not going to graduate with a diploma, right? Or that my child is not going to get a diploma. Entonces, el IEP, la razón por la cual yo ingresé a esto de la interpretación en educación especial es porque El proceso del IEP es un proceso colaborativo. El objetivo es resumir los puntos claves. El IEP es un documento vigente, es un documento vivo por hacer la que se tiene que generar y colaborar y se tiene que venir y juntar y se genera durante la reunión. Entonces, si las familias, si yo como intérprete, yo puedo ser el mejor intérprete del mundo y si no estoy proporcionando los servicios de la forma que se debe ser para que los padres puedan proporcionar información, puedan participar de una forma significativa, de nada va a servir que yo sea el mejor intérprete si no estoy trabajando con la familia para asegurarme de que todo esté claro, que haya un entendimiento, que haya un proceso colaborativo. Y parte de la capacitación de un intérprete es que nunca debemos integrarnos al proceso de la interpretación. Pero en este caso, debido a que es un proceso colaborativo, es diferente a otro tipo de interpretación. So the last piece I said is, as your formal training as an interpreter dictates that you never need to insert yourself into the process, right? Because sometimes as special education interpreters, we kind of straddle that fine line between the word that we're never supposed to use in interpretation is advocacy, right? I see a question there, and I will make sure that I get to that. Thank you. So we want to make sure that we are, as interpreters, we're not advocating, but at the same time, we kind of put ourselves in such a position that if we're not supporting that collaborative process, then of course you can't have that meaningful participation. And it's unique because my training as an interpreter was, you are neutral. You know, they used to say you are invisible. I disagree with that statement. I am not invisible. I'm neutral. I'm not invisible, because if I was invisible, then we couldn't have a meeting, right? But understanding the nuance of that is really, really important. I'll get to that question. I'm going to skip this part here, and I'm going to get to, so what do professional interpreters do? Okay, ¿qué hacen los intérpretes profesionales? Okay. One thing they do is they define the type of interpretation. As they arrive, they identify, okay, are we going to work simultaneously, meaning you talk and I talk, and we're going without having to stop, right? And they review the administrative sections of the IEP. This is really important. An interpreter, a professional interpreter in a special education context, is trained to understand the different sections, the administrative sections of the IEP. They have that context, right? They interpret the interventions of the team members, and they're sometimes required to provide that on-site translation. And then, of course, they follow up with the translation. Entonces, definir qué tipo de interpretación. Los intérpretes deciden si va a ser simultáneo, hablamos a la misma vez, revisar tienen la capacidad para revisar las secciones administrativas y cómo interpretar las intervenciones de los miembros, la traducción in situ de documentos cuando es una traducción a vista, y luego dar el seguimiento sobre la traducción. And of course, here again, being bilingual is not being a professional interpreter. They're the person at the table with the experience in communication. I see a question in the chat that says, as an interpreter, at what time did you cross the line to make sure that the concepts were being understood, and that the parents were not able to admit that they didn't understand? I would love to address that question after I'm done. Con todo gusto, si se quiere quedar después, me gustaría responder a su pregunta, señora Karina, porque es una muy excelente pregunta. So again, train in the vocabulary and the specialized concepts, and then of course the professional guidelines. I want to now move to this part. This is the SIF guidelines. The SIF guidelines are essentially really the key, kind of these were developed in the medical profession, and we use them in education interpretation, because I've already kind of said that, because education interpretation is so nuanced and so much about working in the spirit of collaboration. Sometimes the rules and concepts and ethics of the profession within the context of medical or legal cannot be so stringently applied to education. But for the most part, the SIF guidelines, confidentiality, use the I person language. You'll notice interpreters will use first person when they speak. So if I'm speaking on behalf, or if I'm interpreting for someone, I don't say the parent said. I speak as if I were the parent, right? They manage the pace of the meeting, making sure that the information is flowing for all parties. And then of course that they have an obligation, that E in the SIF is that they have an obligation to interpret everything that's said during the meeting. I can't tell you how many times I have to tell family members, whatever you say, I'm going to have to interpret, right? Even if it's the use of profanity, even if it's a sidebar conversation about a teacher that they don't like, I'm going to have to say, I'm going to have to interpret it because I am legally obligated. The rules and guidelines of my profession dictate that I must do that. Entonces, hablando con las guías de CIF, esto es simplemente guardar la confidencialidad, hablar siempre en el uso de la primera persona. No se dice la mamá o el papá o el señor dijo, se habla como que si yo fuera la persona hablando. Eso es lo que ayuda a generar ese puente del manejo de la interpretación. Y se aseguran los intérpretes que fluya la comunicación. Y lo más importante, que estamos obligados a traducir, a interpretar todo lo que se dice durante la reunión. Así que si por ahí está teniendo una conversación al lado con otra persona y está hablando mal del maestro o la maestra, o si dice una mala palabra, o si por ahí empieza a hablar de otra cosa, es nuestra obligación interpretar todo eso. I'm going to skip this part because we're running out of time. So, how do I make the most of the resource of a professional interpreter during my meeting? Entonces, donde brincamos unas partes, ¿cómo puedo aprovechar el máximo el recurso de intérprete profesional durante mi junta? Bueno, lo primero sería preparación. Every professional interpreter, so the first part would be preparation. Every professional interpreter that arrives at a meeting, one of their first duties is to check in with families and to make sure that they understand that I am here to amplify your voice. I am here to make sure that all of your concerns, all of your questions are addressed and talked about, and then that I give context to the family. You know, I am merely your voice. I am not an advocate. I'm not here to provide any advice or any type of support beyond the support of fostering language. Entonces, lo primero es la preparación, ¿sí? Como todos miembros del equipo, una cosa que un intérprete debe hacer es estar preparado para trabajar con usted, pero usted esté al pendiente, piense de sus inquietudes, las áreas de interés, las metas para su alumno, qué es lo que hacen bien, prepare preguntas y háblelas con el intérprete antemano para que el intérprete esté preparado. So, you know, gather these questions. You know, when you talk about preparation, think about those concerns. Think about those areas of interest. Think about all those things that you're going to be asked during the meeting and give that information. Front load your interpreter with that information. Whenever possible, I tell my team, you know, my team usually is supposed to arrive 30 minutes prior to the start of a meeting so that we have this briefing period, that we can brief with families so that we can go specifically over all of those things. Because what does this do? This gives your interpreter context. It gives your interpreter an understanding of who the child is. Okay, I know who this child is. Okay, I heard this question earlier. Okay, I have background, I have context. I'm better able to serve you as an interpreter if I know this information. So then now, me brinca algo, no. So, expresarnos con respecto al ritmo de la junta, ¿sí? Hablar de los temas de áreas de interés que son más importantes para usted. Asegúrese de darle esa información a su intérprete de antemano. En nuestro distrito, los intérpretes están obligados a llegar 30 minutos antes para tener este tiempo. No siempre es posible que se pueda tomar ventaja de eso, pero es importante que usted le dé una información de fondo al intérprete para que cuando entre a la junta ya conozca a su hijo o hija y pueda expresar esta información para que cuando le den esta información no se quede usted como que de qué están hablando, ¿sí? So, you know, really important thing here is, again, these are kind of running down the list. It's an extension of the previous slide, but, you know, making sure that we have efficient use of time. A lot of times, you know, families go into meetings and they're told they only have an hour with an interpreter. Or other times families go into a meeting and they already know they're going to have to leave early. They're going to have a part 2 IEP, right? These are really important things to know because this cues your interpreter in so that if there is a moment where the interpreter needs to step up, you remember, we're advocates for language access, we're advocates for fostering communication. So if this is all information that you're able to give your interpreter prior to the meeting, that's that context again, right? Es importante expresar, si uno se siente abrumado con la información, poder también, si necesita un descanso, poder dárselo al intérprete. You know, a lot of the times, you know, because you have another voice speaking for you, if you're not expressing that you're feeling overwhelmed with the information, you know, that extra barrier between you and the rest of the team, that person that acts as the interpreter, can sometimes make it difficult for you to say, is it okay for me to take a break? And as staff members to, you know, if the interpreter doesn't say this, that staff members are able to communicate this to families and say, well, let's make sure that families understand that they have agency over the communication process, and that needs to be communicated via the interpreter, and not think that because they have an interpreter, well, I can't stop the proceedings, right? Finally, we're the bridge to clarifying cultural context, right? A professional interpreter is really knowledgeable and sensitive to how different cultural contexts or perspectives may affect communication. Los intérpretes están ahí para aclarar el contexto cultural. Un intérprete profesional tiene el conocimiento de cómo acercarse a esos procesos. I have 3 examples there, and I want to share an example with you all. I know we've kind of reached time. I'll be very quick, but I want to share an example that happened to me when I was a very novice interpreter about 16 years ago. I was in an IEP meeting, and there was a conversation with the occupational therapist, and the occupational therapist was working with the family because one of the goals that they were working on, and this is me when I was young, a new interpreter. So I would have handled that situation completely differently, but it was still a really eye-opening experience for me nonetheless. They were working with the family, and what they really wanted to do is they wanted to get this family to work with the team to help the student not use his hand when he was eating with his fork to scoop food onto the fork, right? They were trying to teach it was an occupational therapy goal where they were helping the student. They wanted the student not to use his hands to scoop food onto the plate. And I'm watching this, and this is going back and forth, and it's going back and forth, and it's going back and forth, and they're trying this thing. Maybe we could do this, or maybe we can do that. I mean, it was kind of an absurd thing to begin with, but then it dawned on me, and I said to the family, this is the first time that I had ever asked for this cultural timeout, right? That interpreters will do all the time, especially a professionally trained interpreter is required to do this. I asked for timeout, and I said, interpreter speaking, because that's what interpreters do. When an interpreter is going to insert themselves and no longer is using first person, the interpreter has to say, interpreter timeout, interpreter break for clarification. And I said, can I ask the family a question? And the whole team was like, how dare this guy ask? What? I said, I just have a quick question, because we're talking about the scooping on the fork. And I said to Dad, I said, do you eat with a tortilla at home? And the father said, of course, what Mexican family doesn't use a tortilla when they eat a meal, right? So if you think about it, to any Mexican who eats with a tortilla, the left or the right hand is essentially a device for holding the tortilla, and the other thing, the spoon or the fork, is just, it works in a scooping action, right? So at school, this child didn't have a tortilla, so therefore, in the absence of a tortilla, the child was using their hand, right? And that kind of changed my outlook as an interpreter and the importance of that cultural context. And I think it changed, I don't know if it did anything to change the goal, but it did something that changed the way the folks that were using the interpreter thought about this cultural context, right? And I'm going to tell that story quickly in Spanish. I promise to tell it really fast. Les cuento la historia rapidito que cuando yo era un intérprete nuevo, estuve en una junta donde querían que un niño dejara de usar su mano para poner la comida en la tortilla. Y lo que sucedió es que seguían dando vueltas, no sabían cómo, disculpen, no en la tortilla, usando la mano con el tenedor, que no usara la mano, que usara nomás el tenedor. Querían quitarle esa costumbre. Y yo estaba sentado en un intérprete nuevo y por fin me atrevo a decir algo. Yo nomás oía que daban vueltas y por fin me atrevo a decir algo. Bueno, le puedo pedir tiempo, porque eso los intérpretes pueden hacer, pedir tiempo, y si quiero hacer una aclaración cultural. ¿Le puedo hacer una pregunta a la familia? Me dicen sí. Le hago la pregunta a la familia, le pregunto, señor, al papá le digo, señor, ¿usted en su casa come con tortilla? Y el señor me dice, claro, ¿qué mexicano no come con tortilla? Entonces ahí yo le explico al grupo, mire, lo que sucede es que este muchacho, este niño en su casa está acostumbrado a tener la tortilla en una mano y el tenedor en la otra, y así es como come. En la escuela no hay tortilla, entonces tiene que usar la mano. Y ahí fue donde el grupo y yo como intérprete entendí la importancia de aclarar estos contextos culturales. Entonces ahí el equipo también se dio cuenta, he ahí la importancia de tener a este intérprete profesional. And then finally, share your experience, right? Finalmente comparta su experiencia, hable de sus observaciones, otra vez con el intérprete, talk about your observations. And, these are things that are common. These are things that are like, things that are discussed in any type of basics of IEP training, wonderful trainings that are given here by EFRC. This is par for the course as far as like, how do I prepare for an IEP? But as a family that maybe perhaps doesn't have access to this information and doesn't have access to an interpreter prior to the meeting, sharing this information, not just with the team, but with the interpreter before the meeting. So briefing is so important. Entonces, no nomás, estos son conceptos que se hablan en cualquier capacitación para participar en un IEP, cómo participar de forma equitativa, de forma significativa. Estas son cosas que son cosas generales que se hablan y se discuten, pero no se habla de que hay que compartir eso con el intérprete, las observaciones sobre la habilidad del alumno, la motivación, las experiencias, todo lo que le pueda dar información de fondo al intérprete para que el equipo pueda tener un buen concepto, un buen perfil de lo que es el alumno. Finally, I promise I'm done here. Activate your voice, right? This is really, really important. Interpreters are there to amplify and activate the voice of the family. In a way, sometimes you could say that having an interpreter kind of like could potentially amplify your voice more than if you were just an English speaker, you didn't have that person participating on your behalf or as an interlocutor for you. Hay que activar su voz, hay que expresar sus preferencias, qué es lo que funciona mejor y abogar por su estudiante. And that is essentially the end of my presentation. I know I went through that really fast. I wish I had more time to discuss more things. But if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them. And I can address that question that Karina asked. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, con todo gusto estoy aquí para responder a sus preguntas.
Okay, thank you, Mario.